I ended up feeling incredibly hollow. It's like I was chasing money, I was chasing women, I was chasing status, I was chasing power, all of the worldly goals, which really only lead you to more distance between you and your authentic self that doesn't need any of those things. And so in my own hero's journey, I found myself sitting on the couch. I was drinking and partying Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I found myself sitting there going, I just can't do this anymore. If I extrapolate this for the rest of my life, I wouldn't want to live if this is what life is about, because I'm finding nothing in this. So I decided to do the opposite of everything that I was doing. I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to, really just go in the opposite direction of my trajectory.
Before we get into the show, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, First Human, of which I am a co-founder. First Human is dedicated to extraordinary impact in the world through exceptional leadership. So if you're looking to elevate the leadership of your team or your organization, then do check us out. We also offer one-to-one coaching. So if you'd like to get coached by me or one of my extraordinarily talented fellow coaches, then head over to firsthuman.com. And with that, back to the show. And we are live for another episode of Being Human. Delighted to say I'm here with Brandon Bozarth, all the way from Texas in the USA. He is a founder of Integrated Somatic Inquiry, as well as a practitioner of Germanic healing knowledge, Germanic new medicine. He's appeared on ABC, Fox News, NBC, and his work has resulted in improvements or resolution of depression, cancer, arthritis, psychosis, anxiety, IBS, to name but a few. He's also a sword enthusiast. So Brandon, a huge warm welcome to Being Human.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Great to have you here. So I've had an interest in German new medicine for a while. I was familiar with the work of Melissa Sell. She was the first person who first introduced me. And so when I came across your work, I was really excited to have you on the show, as well as Somatic Inquiry. We've had Peter Levine on the show. And so I'm familiar with that work. So to find somebody who's integrating both of them is very exciting. And so, really looking to get into this. And like with all my guests, I really want to ground this in your story. So I'd love to hear something of your childhood, where you grew up, some of your formative experiences, and then ultimately, what led you into the path that you're now following.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a middle class neighborhood, and I just remember from a really young age feeling like there was a lot more to life than the American dream. I call that the game that we're offered. Just go to school, get good grades, get a job, and then eventually you'll retire. And I had an older brother who's about 8 years older than me, and he would give me like personal development CDs when I was really young. I remember being like 10 years old, and he gave me like a Deepak Chopra tape about being able to headache just by awareness, just by not resisting it and putting your awareness on it. And my headache would heal. And so it was like these little seeds were planted, and he was a big influence on me growing up. And he would show me, conspiracy theory videos, and I'd start to question things and go, wait a second, the school system, the education system, the financial system, they're all owned by the same group of people. What's going on here? And in high school, I started a club called the Brotherhood, but it was in Gaelic. But part of my origins are Gaelic. And so meet up and we would just watch videos, and I was really in search of truth. I wouldn't have called it that at the time. And about 2 years after high school graduating, I ended up dropping out of college to follow an inspiration. A friend showed me network marketing, and it was a culture based in personal growth and transformation. You can make as much money as you want to make. You can be your own boss. Everything that sounds so good, especially to a young kid. And long story short, about 3 years of being in that industry, I did fairly well. I got to travel a lot. I got to meet a lot of, influential people. But I ended up feeling incredibly hollow. It's like I was chasing money, I was chasing women, I was chasing status, I was chasing power, all of the worldly goals, which really only lead you to more distance between you and your authentic self that doesn't need any of those things. And so in my own hero's journey, I found myself sitting on the couch. I was drinking and partying Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I found myself sitting there going, I just can't do this anymore. If I extrapolate this for the rest of my life, I wouldn't want to live if this is what life is about, because I'm finding nothing in this. So I decided to do the opposite of everything that I was doing. I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to, really just go in the opposite direction of my trajectory.
And this was what, in your early 2020?
I'm about 24.
Right.
Yeah. And so then I have a insight and I go, what I'm going to do, because a lot of what network marketing was I was passionate about, but it was really about the people, serving the people. And I would see transformations in people. So I go, I don't need this big, ostentatious presentation to just help people. But what if I just did that? Even though I have no qualifications, no certifications. But what if I just did that and with no promise of income either? And so I just decided, I'm just going to follow this impulse of what I'm excited to do moment by moment. And sometimes it'll look like wanting to support people with what I've learned, what I picked up in my journey thus far. Sometimes it would be just writing and sharing and speaking and sharing online. And so I started a newsletter. I literally started the newsletter by just making a post. Say, if you want to get on my newsletter, just comment on this post. And I put a newsletter out. And the email landed in the inbox of a woman moments before she was going to kill herself. So she was in Australia and she was sitting in a car at the beach, parked at the beach. And she had a handful of sleeping pills. And she was going to take them and go to the ocean and fall asleep and drown. And she's sitting there, she's contemplating killing herself. And now she's a renowned medium in Australia. So in her words, her guides came in and said, hey, don't take those pills, just turn on the radio first. You could take them later if you want, just turn on the radio. Turn the radio on. And a song played, then it said word for word, you should stay a little bit longer. And she stops in that moment, starts crying, puts the pills down. And then in that next moment, she gets my email, my newsletter. And it's entitled, I'm excited to die. And of course, I wasn't referring to physical death. I was referring to the non-physical death, right? Ego death, you could say. Because that's really what I was going through. I was like, what if I just released everything? I had my own personal surrender experiment. And what happens when you do that? Everything comes to the surface. So I'm sharing about my experience. She gets that message. She reads it. She's crying. She reaches out to me, says, I want you to coach me. I go, what is that? I don't consider myself a coach, but we can get on a phone call and I'll share what's natural for me to share. So I had a beginner's mind. I had no expectations on who I needed to be or what it needed to look like. And because of that, I showed up and just what flowed out of me flowed out of me. I didn't know any other way. And it was transformative for her. It was transformative for me. She ended up after that session saying, I will pay your bills for you if you just talk to me 12 times a week. And I said, okay, that's great. Because I just had my car repossessed and I completely let it all go.
Wow.
So we start meeting weekly, twice a week. And over 6 months, she loses maybe 50 or 60 pounds. She reconciles a relationship with her father. She gets a new job. So much of her life starts changing. And I remember one session, she told me how her life had changed and mine as well had changed in the process. But it was a moment of me going, okay, this is what I'm here for. There's something here I can't explain that feels so natural to me that other people might look at and say, oh, there's a gift or he's a leader or whatever it might be. But I'd say the same thing about anyone's really authentic expression.
Right.
So it's not necessarily special. It's just I can't help it. And so that led me to this path of, okay, I need to learn. I need some mentors. I need people in this that are masters of what they do. And that led me to a mentor in Los Angeles named Javon Langford, a renowned men's coach. And I found him because a friend said, hey, I saw this article. It's like the top 30 entrepreneurs under 30 are philanthropists or something. And he sent me that article and I just read his story and I resonated and I found him on Facebook and we got on a phone call. And I basically spent my last $300 to go sleep on his couch and learn from him. I said, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll help you build your business. I just want to learn from you. And I felt that pull so strongly. Fast forward about 2 years, he's taking me through his retreats, his intensives, and this is a highly trained individual, and the way that he would work with people and the miracles, the transformation, the healing that I saw take place. It was almost like I was a plumber in the union apprenticing for a couple of years in this immersive environment, seeing over and over everything from abuse to rape. I mean, it was really powerful healing work. And about 2 years into it, I decided to create my own practice. And I started doing retreats in different parts of the world. And that lasted until about 2021. So from about 2015, 2016 to 2021. Then I got into a relationship that, my mentor, Giovanni, used to say, there's always that one relationship that if you still have unconsciousness running the show, you will, via necessity, have to confront what's underneath the hood, which is also what I've come to see through German medicine. The higher purpose of our symptoms is it's going to say, hey, by necessity, you have to stop and discover the deepest aspects of your psyche that keep you out of your biological design. And so I got into this relationship that was an incredibly narcissistic kind of relationship. I didn't have any boundaries. I couldn't say no. I'm overriding my intuition over and over. And it was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. And for the first time in my life, I developed chronic issues and chronic symptoms, brain fog, forgetfulness, insomnia. My indigestion was so bad. My blood alkalinity was an 8.3. My doctors were saying, you're almost in full alkalosis.
And what's a normal blood alkalinity?
I think it's 7 point. It's near 7.0 to 7.5, I think, somewhere in there. But each level is a, the difference between 7.5 and 7.6 is significant.
Right.
So, and you can die from being too alkaline or too acidic. And the reason that was happening is my digestion was so impacted by the trauma bonding in this relationship that I wasn't digesting protein, so it was fermenting, and the ammonia, the gas, was just getting into my blood and changing the pH of my entire system. So, man, I thought I was dying. I mean, I probably was. I would get out of bed, I'd walk to the kitchen, forget why I was there, go back to bed, remember, go back to the kitchen, forget, do ping pong 3 or 4 times, go, what the heck is going on with me? So this is the real ego death, because now I had to let go of my entire business. And eventually that relationship, it was like the worst form of betrayal I've ever experienced. And then I had to face, well, obviously you wound up in this position because you agreed to some sort of dynamic. What's underneath the hood? What have you not seen? And so here I am. I've just let everything go, my relationship, my previous home, my business. And there's no way, everything that I'm doing, people are going, oh, you have mold. Oh, you were, it's some people are, it's from trauma. But most people are saying it's from mold or a virus. And so I'm doing, and mind you, over these 5 years, I've done everything from vegan, raw vegan, mucus-free diet, elimination diet, carnivore, keto, paleo, intuitive eating. I mean, all of it. And so I'm employing everything that I've learned. I'm doing all the supplements, the herbs, the detoxes, the binders, and nothing's improving. And I stumbled upon a podcast from Alex Zek, who was interviewing Dr. Melissa Sell. And seeing Melissa talk about German medicine, it was like everything in my body lit up. I was like, I know there's some truth here. And there was a moment where it became so real, I went all in. And people have these moments with German medicine. You might hear about it. Maybe you've heard about it last year. But to actually accept German new medicine usually takes people a lot of time, because what you're also accepting is that viruses do not exist. Bacteria and pathogens aren't the cause of disease. And there's an implication of radical responsibility and self-discovery, which is uncomfortable for a lot of people. So I started looking at this map, kind of put it aside. I was kind of hot and cold. Okay, could it just be what's happening in the deepest aspects of my psyche that are affecting my brain, that are then affecting the organ that aspect part of the brain controls. And one day, this was in my last relationship, my partner at the time, she leaves, and I didn't want her to leave at the time. We were going through a lot, and there was a part of me that was like, I don't want you to leave. But I said yes anyway. And when she left, I had 2 days of such heightened anxiety. I mean, I could barely sleep. Cold hands, cold feet. This is the conflict active state in German New Medicine. They talk about the 2 phases, law of 2 phases. You're either conflict active, so that's the adaptation phase. You're adapting to a shocking, stressful experience, or you're in a healing phase. Western medicine calls it a cold disease and hot disease. And there are 2 different categories. This shows there's 2 sides of the same coin. So I'm conflict active. She comes home. We speak and reconcile. I'm able to hug her. And that next morning, I break out in a rash in my armpits. And I go, oh, how interesting. This, instead of going to the mold, instead of going to the physical cause, I'm going to see what German New Medicine has to say about this. And what it said was, you wanted someone really close to you, but they couldn't be close to you. So as soon as you were able to hug them again, you're going to go into the healing phase, and it's going to hit the underarms because that represents the desire to embrace someone. And that was the exact thing, the exact experience I was having in my psyche. And mind you, I didn't know that going into that experience. It wasn't a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was just getting into German New Medicine. I knew about a couple conflicts. So I wasn't even educated. So I looked at this and going, oh my God, this maps exactly over my experience. And from that point, I just went all in with German New Medicine. I said, okay, I'm going to give up on an herb saving me, a supplement saving me, a meal saving me, a meal plan or a way of eating or diet. And I'm going to go all in with the German New Medicine framework. And that over the next 2 years, led to combining that work that I learned early on with this framework, that we can then see someone's symptoms and I could see what's happening in the psyche and then use the tools that I know to get in there and reconcile or alleviate the constraints in really core identity that are the cause of disease or that originate in the psyche.
Right. Wow. So there was a ton in there. I could really see how you've gone deep on this journey, having such a visceral experience of this matchup between what German New Medicine says you would experience and what you're actually experiencing, from that scenario. That makes total sense. So for people who've not heard of German New Medicine, perhaps we should start there. What is it? And what's its view on disease?
Yeah, really good question. So in short, Dr. Hammer was, I think this was going to be maybe in the late 1970s, early 1980s. His son died by accident. He was shot. There's actually a whole documentary on it on Netflix. He was accidentally shot, and it was sudden and shocking. And 6 months after his death, Dr. Hammer formed testicular cancer. And this is right when the mind-body connection was being really legitimately established in the scientific world. And so he said, there has to be a correlation or connection between my son's death and my testicular cancer. And this was when CAT scans started to become popular. So he said, I'm going to scan my brain and take a look, see if I see anything on my brain, the aspect of the brain that governs my reproductive organs. And right where he thought there might be something that have changed or adapted, he found this circle, this circular imprint, similar to the rings on a tree, which is actually how you determine the age of a DHS, which again is the name of this ring. It ended up being named after him, Dirk-Hammer syndrome. So when he looked at his brain, he saw this circle, perfect circle right over the part of the brain that governs reproduction. He goes, this can't be a coincidence. Now, what is this? Yeah, the literature in science, it's probably just a shadow from the CT scan. So we took it to CT scan specialists and had them look at it from all these different angles, and they determined, no, this is not a shadow. This is actually on your brain. So what he realized, he goes, okay, so I wonder if a loss in the family, a profound loss, it doesn't have to be with family, but often it is, but a sense of profound loss that's shocking. Later, he went on to describe the 3 criteria. It has to be shocking, you have to be isolated, and there's some sense of overwhelm and being caught on the wrong foot. So when those 3 hit at once, you'll have a DHS. And the DHS, people can call it trauma, but trauma is so gray nowadays. Everyone's, oh, my trauma this, my trauma that. So a lot of things that we think, there might be things that we're having that are causing psychological stress, but that's very different from being affected biologically. We can have psychological stress without a DHS. When it affects the brain, when it goes from an event in the psyche with those 3 criteria to an actual DHS on the brain, then that's going to change the organ. And when there's a series of these, that's called a constellation. We can talk about that later. It won't just change organs, it will change hormones, and it will change behavior. Things like megalomaniac, bipolar, psychosis, all of it is an adaptation to a series of DHS, unresolved DHS. So he found this mark on his brain. He goes, okay, I'm going to interview other people with cancer, with testicular cancer. And he interviewed them and scanned their brains. He found the same exact mark on their brain that governs their reproductive system. And when he interviewed them, just previous to when they developed the cancer, they all had a profound loss conflict. And he started to piece it together. He go, okay, what's happening here? Well, he realized in the conflict active phase, there's a kind of cell proliferation. So for him, when his son died, his biology said, my line, what is the purpose of biology? To reproduce, to survive. So if my line is ended, I'm going to have a temporary adaptation that's going to create cell proliferation in the testicles. That's going to give me the ability to produce more semen so I can have a better chance of reproducing. So as long as that conflict active phase is turned on, then that adaptation will be turned on. Now, let's say let's say he had sex with his wife, or maybe his wife got pregnant, and he grieved the loss. He was able to come out of conflict activity. Well, then he would go into the healing phase, and that's usually where the swelling occurs. The water and the blood rush to that area. It starts to swell. People call that metastasizing. And what's actually happening is it's bringing bacteria to the excess cells that are no longer needed, because bacteria are the surgeons, nature's surgeon. Like when a tree falls in nature, what happens? Bacteria and fungi decompose it. Same thing happens in our body. And so he started to, through his own investigation, recognize what he later termed the 5 laws, but law of 2 phases, that the origin of all disease is a DHS that starts in the psyche, then hits the brain, then hits the organ. That's the order. The 2 phases, the microbe synergy, that these microbes work with us, they're not against us. And he ended up doing over 40,000 brain scans and interviews. And in that time, didn't find one contradiction to these laws. That everyone with every major disease that's been mapped first encountered a DHS, a shocking moment in their psyche, then it affects their brain, then it affects their organ. And he ended up mapping all of the corresponding, what are called biological conflicts, which are the event in the psyche. He mapped all of the conflicts, their conflict active phase and their healing phase, and the kind of entire healing arc, which will completely contradict Western medicine and ultimately abolish fear when it comes to what's my body doing? Is it just this machine that breaks down? Is it attacking itself for no meaningful reason? Is it just, and none of this is true. It's all happening for a very specific reason, either to help you adapt or to heal or repair something. There's no gray zone in between that says, my body's just confused or breaking down. That's not a shared a view in German medicine.
Right. Okay. And so just take the first part of this, the conflict active phase. So he's running this biological program to produce more cells in his testicles. Did he verify that he was actually producing more semen? Like, that seemed a bit did that happen?
With him at that time, I don't know. I'd have to research it more. The interesting part about German medicine is there are still thousands of pages of Dr. Hammer's writings in German that haven't been translated to English. So there's a team I'm familiar with that's working on the translations right now. They have a study group that they host, and there's a lot more about his personal experience. And it's funny because I've actually asked that exact question. I said, did they, before the adaptation phase, because you can do the same thing with the stomach adaptation, it's either cell proliferation or cell loss. Now we know that there is cell proliferation and cell loss because we could see that under the microscope. But in terms of, did he measure if it actually produced more semen or not? I don't know if he did.
Yeah, because that would one thing. Well, the first question I would ask, and for these other biological responses, do they provide beneficial effects in the body? Because that seems central to the thesis here, that they're actually useful adaptations, right?
Right. I'll give an example.
Because I can imagine on first blush, people might look at that and think, well, hang on, how does getting cancer of the balls help me have more kids, right? Like just on its face.
Well, again, in the conflict active phase, it's not like a massive tumors. It's the cell proliferation isn't necessarily noticeable to us because it's happening at a smaller level. But in the repair phase, when there's inflammation and when there's growth, they're being filled with water and blood. This is why you see like they've seen the kind of like veins. They're like you see these blood vessels also in tumors, and so blood, water are the carriers of bacteria, and you'll always find decaying tissue as well. Now, if you're in what's called a hanging healing, this can last for years and years because you're going conflict active, adaptation turns on. You're going into a healing phase, it turns off, but you're not giving yourself the chance to actually totally decompose and resolve the issue because you keep going in between conflict activity and resolution or repair. And that's another word. That in German medicine, we'd call that a hanging healing. In Western medicine, they call that a chronic condition.
Right. Okay. And that's so from a German medicine's perspective, you're not finding a way to resolve this conflict that you've experienced. You're not finding a way to release this trauma, we might say.
Yeah. I'll give you just a short example. I had a woman, she came to a retreat. This is maybe 4 years ago now, and she had fibroids, uterine fibroids. And what is our first home biologically? It's the womb. So we have an association in the psyche, home to womb. And she felt really unsafe in her home currently because of the dynamic in her partnership. I think she may have had some early trauma in the womb that happened through mother at that time as well. So what happens is when we get a certain shock, when we get a DHS, it primes our psyche to interpret other shocking moments in a familiar way. It's like in neuroscience where they show the continued deepening and widening of certain neural pathways. You keep creating evidence of its truth. Automatically, it's a kind of bias. So her partner that she was living with also came to the retreat. So we sat them down and we worked through, we just worked through for hours with them to come to resolution and forgiveness. And there was a massive emotional release on the other side for this woman. 2 weeks later, and in general, when you fully resolve, especially for cancer, a lot of times it doesn't take more than 2 weeks actually to completely dissolve a tumor, or in this case, a fibroid. So she already had scans, and we didn't even know about this. She only showed us this after because she didn't want to scare us. So she has these scans, and she's scheduled for surgery. 2 weeks later, she goes in for the surgery. They scan her. They're using, the what's it called? When you scan, you're looking for baby. You're looking
ultrasound.
For ultrasound. I just want to say it. So, ultrasound. And they say, okay, we can't find the fibroid. Let's check here. Let's check here. Let's check here. And they just couldn't find it. They said, you don't need the surgery, and it's absolutely gone. And they showed her the scans, and now we have this before and after in this 2-week period that when she resolved her conflict, which is not feeling safe in the home, which the fibroid is like, let's create the adaptation in German medicine would say it's the attempt to create another womb or to reinforce the womb.
Okay.
Then it was no longer needed. And so our psyches have the ability to override our biology because the biology doesn't know the difference between, the conflict in our psyche versus the real threat to our life that might be in the world, like this
Right.
tiger. So the same adaptations can get turned on as if it were a physical threat, even though she wasn't in danger. It wasn't an abusive situation, but she was perceiving it that way, and so her biology adapted. And as soon as it was resolved, hence resolving of the actual physical symptoms.
Wow. And this is really quite extraordinary, isn't it? Because the way that Western medicine perceives this cancer is it's something we need to excise from the body. It's
Right.
actually a threat to the body. It's not part of a healing process. It's something we need to address, deal with, and is potentially lethal.
Yeah.
And so this must require an extraordinary leap of faith for people, I can imagine, to accept that this is part of a healing process, and that for them to accept that and focus on healing their own conflicts as opposed to dealing with this tumor. Is that something you find?
Absolutely. But I want to break down faith. So this is my understanding of faith. Faith isn't blind. Faith is I'm gathering reasonable, logical evidence to back this theory, and then I practice it in my direct experience, and then I gather more information that can lead to application, that can lead to my direct experience. And I do that so much that I go, now the opposite theory, the old theory, actually seems less likely and less realistic based on my direct experience than the new theory. And I'll give you an example of that. I had my brain scanned, and I had my brain scanned and read by someone that was trained directly by Dr. Hammer. Only about 3 or 4 people in the world know how to read CT scans like Dr. Hammer. He looks at my brain scan and he goes, about 1.5 years ago, you were with a woman that you thought could have your children, and she left you. And he knows nothing about my story.
Wow.
And he could see it based on the DHS, because my psyche is interpreting events that, like, let's say the territory loss in my temporal lobe. A man's biological territory is his work and his woman, and more of his external environment he considers his territory. This is why men always love to have man caves. I need to have my own space. Now, a woman's territory is her internal territory. It's her sexuality. It's her emotions. So when a woman feels like a man is not listening to her or is, dominating her emotionally, she'll have a territory conflict like territory anger, for example, where a man's territory anger might be initiated by a noisy neighbor that he just can't control. And that's going to affect his temporal lobe, and that may create some indigestion. My dad always had indigestion growing up because we had this noisy neighbor, and no matter what, when he would move out, another one would come in. And then every time we would go on vacation, or he would even just be out of the house and eating lunch, the same food, he would get no indigestion. But as soon as he was home, he could eat the same food and he would get indigestion and acid reflux. Once he moved away and there was no noisy neighbors and he wasn't in territory anger, which hits the part of the brain that controls the stomach, he didn't need to use his Tums anymore. And so he's able to look at this brain scan and interpret how my psyche has interpreted certain events, and therefore imply or assert what the events actually were. So he's also looking at it and going, at age 17, by reading the rings of the DHS, he could know about when it happened. You felt like in one event, you let everyone down and you didn't meet everyone's expectations of you. It was a really big event. Well, at 17, it was it was 17, it wasn't 16 or 18, it was 17. I was primed to be one of the best football players on the team. And I had scouts and I was doing really well. The very first home game, I broke my collarbone. And that's exactly how I felt. Oh my God, I've let everyone down, my team down. And it was one of the most intense depressions I had as a, teenager. He looks at it and goes, "Oh, by the way, what book are you reading? Or are you writing?" He could tell I was writing a book because of the behavior. When you have a certain constellation of conflicts, you'll have a behavioral change, and that has been codified. You go, yeah, people that have this one tend to write books, categorize information, da da da. It's a way of adapting to the conflict load that actually helps alleviate the conflict load.
Wow.
And what it also points to is that in every conflict and shadow, there's a gift. There's a super sense. The people, let's say, for example, that have been abused physically or tortured or raped, some of the most intense aspects of the human experience, they'll describe, for example, being out of their body. Now, underneath the brain scan, that looks like a series of conflicts that we call a flying constellation. And it allows you to have that point of view. It's a kind of, you could say, disassociation, but it also allows you to see from a higher perspective than is considered the norm. And these kind of people can go into a business and have such radical imagination that you might go, "Oh, that's unrealistic. That's, come back down to earth." But they can see things no one else can see. They might have more psychic gifts, which is really just their ability to tune into information from a different point of view than someone that doesn't have that specific constellation. So there are these super senses that form as we adapt to these shocking experiences.
Yeah, and I've heard that described elsewhere as post-traumatic growth. And I've also heard of certain indigenous traditions where some kids were deliberately traumatized to effectively turn them into shamans for the village, which sounds horrific, but it would match that thesis. Right. Yeah. And actually what you said about your father there and the Tums made sense to me because I had suffered IBS, irritable bowel, for sort of through my teens and through my 20s. And then I did a ton of therapy in my early 30s and noticed that my IBS was reducing with all of my sort of trauma release work, but I was still getting it acutely whenever I visited my parents. And that was an indication to me that I still had work to do, around, traumas were associated with my parents. And I sort of 3 or 4 years down the line after that, I had and I have no IBS, and I haven't had a IBS for over a decade. And I think what I was effectively doing, was resolving, in German new medicine terms, I was resolving my conflicts. I was just using a different paradigm, but I was effectively using, the same mechanism, which was resolving these conflicts, just not using those terms. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And we call that a track in German new medicine. So, for example, in the original DHS forms, for you, indigestible morsel, that's an event that you couldn't digest, often associated with anger. It could be betrayal. It could be even indigestible shame. It depends on where in the digestive tract it hits. Usually the shittier the moment, and like the more disgusting and nasty the argument, that kind of thing, the deeper in the digestive tract it hits. And as you, in that moment of DHS, well, what happens is we go, it's like we have that shock moment, and the subconscious takes a screenshot of what's happening in the environment and tags it. And it goes, okay, mom and dad, threat. Now, maybe I was eating a certain kind of food right when it happened, and my DHS also goes, threat. Maybe there's a perfume in the air. Okay, threat. Last time this happened, I almost died, because that's what the body is perceiving. It's our survival mechanism being turned on. So now, even it's like you come in contact with that fragrance again. You start sneezing, a stink conflict, something that stinks, right? And it's like, but it triggers that track of that original traumatic event. Now, all of a sudden, your indigestion can start acting up, and you go, "Oh, I have an allergy." Or you meet that person again, you go see your parents again, and technically you're allergic to them. We can be allergic to people. If our DHS, if our subconscious associates them with the original shock, then every time we step on the track, we're going to have a mini 2-phase experience. We're going to be a little conflict active. It's usually not going to be as bad as it was. Be a little conflict active. And then as soon as we leave, which for you might have been constipation or bloating while you were with them, and then you leave, with diarrhea, and you start to go into a healing phase again.
Yeah, and what I found that the way I could speed up the healing phase was to touch into my emotions. Like, what do I feel? Is there grief to come up, or is there anger? And I kind of express those emotions, and I found that it much more
And
quickly
that is
allowed me
digesting.
to return to.
That's digesting the experience right there. I had a woman who came in with indigestible shame around abuse that happened. And just by speaking it and feeling it, but then also finding her own innocence in the process and going through the inquiry process, right after she had this massive release and a change in her identity, I'm not bad. That was the core identity, I'm bad, or I'm disgusting. Right? When that changed, in the room, everyone could hear her stomach start grumbling. And she's like, oh, I'm in so much pain. She goes to the bathroom. She comes back. She had the first solid bowel movement. She was in a perpetual diarrhea, which in German medicine, we call that the epicrisis, which is kind of the switch over from conflict active to the healing phase. And so she was stuck in this perpetual phase for months, many months. All she could eat was a liquid diet, and she had 30 allergies diagnosed by a doctor. So she resolves this indigestible shame. She couldn't digest what happened to her. In the expressing, the feeling, the processing, the transforming, she was able to completely digest it. She had her first solid bowel movement in 3 months. She comes out, she looks glowing. She says, I have this feeling. All my allergies are gone. I'm going to go eat in the kitchen right now. It's during a retreat. And she eats all the food that, that the doctor said, you were allergic to, and she was perfectly fine and it hasn't returned. And so same thing. It's like, and for me recently, I had a money morsel. I owed someone money and I paid them off. And I wake up the next morning, I have diarrhea. What was the morsel I couldn't eliminate? The debt.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, this is fascinating. And this relates to something I saw on one of your clips and your appearance with Alex Zek, where you talk about this biological language and you refer to it there like something feels shitty. Well, that's low down in the digestive tract, right?
Yeah.
And I'm familiar with that from my own work. If you hear someone say, I'm suffocating, well, maybe that's a clue there's potentially a birth trauma there or some other trauma that meant that you felt that you couldn't breathe.
Right.
Yeah, no, or I feel like I can't move, right? Well, okay, well, what does that relate to in your part? So that really resonated when you talked about biological language as a tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your father, you mentioned as well. He had cancer, is that right? And that was an experience that was very meaning, for you and your father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He still has cancer. Yeah, I read this study. It said something like the context was Christianity and religion. It said when the father of the household, let's say, becomes a Christian, there's a 90% chance the whole family will follow. If your mother does it, there's a 30% chance. If one of the kids do it, it's like a 8% chance that the whole family will follow. So I've done my best to show him the aspects of German New Medicine that have completely changed my life, and all those things that I've mentioned to you earlier in the podcast, the insomnia, the indigestion. 90% of those symptoms have been resolved by applying the knowledge of German New Medicine. So he's seen it in me, and he's open-minded, and he's definitely made some changes and gotten more in touch with his emotions and whatnot. But there's still some Western medicine programming for him. So what we did discover, which absolutely, again, it blows your mind when you look at the German medicine map and you talk to someone that has no idea about German medicine. You just ask the question. I said to him, before you had thyroid cancer, what was it like in your work? Like, was there by any chance this perpetual feeling of you are always behind or like running late? And he thought a minute. He's like, oh man, yeah, for 2 years, that my employer put me in a position that I didn't necessarily know how to do. I had very little experience. And he said, yeah, this originally it was going to be very temporary, and he was going to put me in my specialized position. So I'm doing a job I don't know how to do. They're underemployed. There's this time pressure for me. He would call me often, meant like sometimes 2 or 3 times a week when I was behind, and be like, all right, Brian, we need you to hurry up. You're not fast enough. You gotta go. What's the conflict associated to the thyroid? Not being fast enough to get a morsel. So what happens is you go into a kind of hyperthyroidism because the body goes, produce more thyroxine, help him actually physically be faster, give him more energy. He's too slow. And so he was in that state for 2 years. Now what happens in the healing phase? There's a kind of hypothyroidism that always follows hyper. And then that lymph or the thyroid gland and potentially some lymph nodes will swell. And that's what started happening. He started forming this lump in his thyroid. And of course, they call it thyroid cancer. And they cut it out. And for him, he had some shocks from that experience, and it ended up traveling. Those shocks would hit different parts of the body, and they traveled. Conventional medicine says, a cell breaks off of the cancer tumor and travels through the blood and then randomly sticks somewhere. Again, now we're going back to a paradigm of random, chaotic materialism and scientism going, oh, this is just random. It's just how it is, which ultimately is going to reflect the worldview of that individual or just random specks on the rock. Mm. And the other point of view goes, wait, that's probably meaningful and happening for a reason. So he had some come to his rib, which is going to be self-evaluation. He had one go to, where else is it now? One on the lung.
Right. So
is grief and fear of death.
So it's like we have these secondary effects. So he's now self-devaluing because there's something I didn't manage to do on my counter. Right. Yeah.
Well, his first shock was, I'm going to die.
Right.
Because he had to have a brain surgery as well. And so the part of the brain that governs the thyroid, now I have to check on if I actually haven't asked him what part of the brain it was on. But it's either going to be the part of the brain that was governing the thyroid or the part of the brain that was governing whatever other adaptations that he had, but got so swollen that he was getting these headaches. And again, when the DHS is repairing, it swells. Typically, you'll get headaches during healing phases because you'll have edema on the brain where that DHS is because it's scarifying that area. It's bringing the bacteria to help scarify and repair. And then when that edema, that fluid's no longer needed, it will squeeze the edema out. And that squeeze is the epicrisis. That squeeze causes things like heart attacks, epileptic seizures, drops in blood sugar, fainting. It's an acute event that is a side effect of the squeezing out of edema, which is you going into the deepest level of healing, which is called vagatonia. So you will deep into vagatonia on the other side of the epicrisis. That's the most challenging part, is the epicrisis. And every conflict has its own epicrisis. So my understanding is he would have been right previous to a epicrisis where he actually started healing and that swelling started to occur and he ended up having to have tissue removed from his brain. So he had multiple moments where he could have easily had a fear of death. And I remember seeing him when they were pulling him away, and he was scared. He was crying, and he was really scared for his life. So when people, Western medicine sees you, they go, "Oh yeah, brain cancer." You're probably going to get shocked, and that's going to, if it's around death, and death and grief are very connected. You can't really have one without the other in terms of grief induced by death. It's going to hit the lung. So if you had a secondary conflict that then showed up as a little cancer on the lung. But he's also been so deprogrammed from Western medicine that he's like, I listen to them. This is where it got me. So I'm just done. I'm just going to go live my life. And he's actually started to live very conflict-free. He retired. He got an inheritance. So he's also resolving a lot of conflicts and really doing what he wants to do. And he's not living in fear anymore. So his cancer has been totally fine for the last 9 years.
Right. So there could be a way, from a German new medicine perspective, that Western medicine actually helps people to resolve their conflicts. So universally does. The Western medicine may help people to resolve their conflicts if they're given the confidence that, I'm going to be better now and these drugs are going to help.
Totally. I mean, yeah, it's like, hey, take this pill and you're going to be totally fine. Oh, thank God. But it could also do the opposite. Hey, you have 6 months to live. Another conflict. Yeah. And now, we got to isolate you in the hospital. Now you have isolation, one of the 3 criteria. Now you have your family arguing and sad, and you're probably getting conflicts from them. And then you can get so constellated with conflicts, and then they're like, "Oh, make sure you juice because that's good for you while you're in this state. You gotta fast or eat crappy, hospital food. Oh, and then let's also put radiation on it. Now every conflict takes 10 times more glucose to just for the adaptation to occur. So when you have all of these conflicts, the energy demand becomes so high, and then throw in a crappy diet and then throw in radiation, a lot of people end up just dying from a lack of energy requirements. That's what you see in cancer patients. They just get so exhausted and tired. Not even necessarily the cancer that's killing them. It's they can't meet the energy demand.
Right. Okay. So one question I have is, why is it then that people tend to get these diseases later in life? Because we can all experience a conflict any time in life. So why are the major deathly diseases occurring later in life?
Yeah, so think of it this way. First of all, as a kid, why do kids get way more sick than adults? They have that phase of like sickness, and then we go, okay, right. I have my immune system has become more robust. Well, it's because children are experiencing many first-time experiences, and so they're shocking. So again, what does it take for a DHS? A shock, being caught on the wrong foot or overwhelmed, and some sense of isolation, be it physical or emotional. So when you're living not biologically, especially not in a tribe, you have kids alone often, or you're sending them away from the mother early on, daycare, school, this sort of thing. They are very prone to conflicts because they're having a lot of first-time experiences. But then typically, they're coming back from daycare, they're coming back from school, the parents come back home from work and the connection is there. They're resolving fairly quickly as well. Because at least, I would hope so. Most children will eventually get the love and attention from their parents. But again, this is very different than living in a tribe. This is why we don't see a lot of chronic disease in tribe whatsoever, because you're really never alone. So that takes isolation away. You have a place in the tribe where you're needed and valued. So your sense of identity and the investment everyone has in you and your well-being is stronger because the tribe depends on you and you depend on the tribe. And you're living biologically, you're moving, you're in the sun. So it's hard to be chronically, you're not going to develop a chronic condition if you're living how you're designed to live. So what happens in childhood, we go through all these firsts, we have all these shocks. First time we're new to the world, but we also resolve fairly quickly for most kids. Now, those shocks, you may have resolved them, but a lot of times it's an unconscious resolution. So you're not aware, as a 6-year-old, this was my conflict, and this is how my psyche interpreted it, and this is how I resolved it. You just were really afraid. You came to your mom and said, hold me, and then you had night sweats that night. And you don't know why, So that same conditioning of the psyche is carried with you into adulthood, but now you're not living biologically. You might just be living alone, working at a desk, isolated. All of the ways that we've adapted to an unbiological society are the perfect grounds for conflict activity without resolution. And if you're not taught this body of work, then you're just going to learn ways to cope with conflict activity, which typically ends up making it worse. And hence you have a chronic condition. So in short, I'd say the reason is because we forgot what living biologically means, what it looks like. And we're not aware that the events and conflicts in our psyche have anything to do with our symptoms. So we're just kind of prone to the conditioning that was laid down for us as children. But we have no emphasis on resolution as adults.
Right, but then why is it that older adults tend to be suffering more from cancer, heart disease, and so on? It tends not to be people. If you look statistically, I haven't checked statistics, but it's more people who are elderly who suffer. Rather than middle-aged.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of them most likely had some symptoms in their 40s and 50s, but it starts really small. And then you're in most people are in hanging healings. Almost 90% of the clients I speak with are in some sort of hanging healing. It's not like the symptom would just popped up at 80. If you really dig back, you're like, oh, there was some indigestion off and on here, and then there was some of this. So typically what happens is that's just when the symptoms that have already been there or that have been there very subtly end up getting exacerbated. And if you look at the elderly population, what do we do with our elders in our society? Well, typically they're isolated, right? They are not valued. It's very different than indigenous or than the village model. They're not, mentoring the youth. There's not this inclusive culture in America. So I'd say the older we get, the more unbiological we get as well, which makes resolution, especially if this is all unconscious, makes resolution harder and harder. So we sustain conflict activity longer. So the more conflict active we are, the longer and the more intense. I'll give a good example. My grandmother had an argument with my uncle maybe 6 years before she passed. And it was, in German New Medicine, we would call it a brutal separation conflict. It was a really intense argument. And it was like, I don't want to see you. I'm out. I'm leaving.
And that's very common, isn't it, in families? With people not
especially when they think of things like the will and inheritance. I mean, there's so much potential at all ages, but especially that age for conflict activity. So they had this falling out. And my grandmother didn't want him to leave or didn't want him to separate. So she suffered a separation conflict. Now, what happens with separation conflicts? Well, when a deer, for example, loses its offspring, it will, if you scan the brain of the deer, which there's been thousands of brain scans on animals too, they have the majority of the same conflicts we do. The deer will forget about the child, will forget how it smells, will forget everything. That part of the brain that holds the memory it'll experience an intense form of short-term memory. And that's to help the deer forget about the child so it's not grieving and looking for the child and leaving the rest of the pack, which would cause it to die and not reproduce again. So to benefit that deer, there's a short-term memory loss. So it can then move on and continue to reproduce. To the degree where if they reintroduce the deer, if it was shocking and traumatic enough, they reintroduce the little deer, the mother will reject it. No, you're not lying. So that same mechanism happens in humans. So what happened to my grandmother? She started to get dementia. She started to forget. And her short-term memory was so acute, they go, oh yeah, you're starting to get dementia. And she ended up having to be put in a home for it. So that's a perfect example of, and she lived to 4. And up to about 90, she was super sharp. She would work 1 or 2 jobs. I mean, she's a legend. And then this one event happened, and about 6 months to a year later, she has Alzheimer's, and then she's starting to forget and fall down, and all this stuff is happening so quickly. We go, okay, was this just some random onset of deterioration, or was this a meaningful response to a shocking event?
Right.
One metaphor.
Or as we sometimes hear in the alternative health community, it could be a build-up of heavy metals in the body, or pesticides in the body.
And here's the thing: this is where, you see these people that are smoking cigarettes till they're 105, and you're going to tell me that woman who's never done a detox in her life doesn't have toxin buildup. So this is where that theory starts to break down. Where you go, of course, that's going to influence our constitution. But no toxic load can turn on or create a DHS. Just can't. It's like an herb. It's not a lack of an herb that causes the DHS. It's not the lack of certain nutrients that causes DHS. There is such thing as malnutrition. There is such thing as toxic overload. But those look very different than, I'll say, if you live in a first world country, that's probably not what you're experiencing, because acute toxic overload looks like you're sweating, you're vomiting, you're puking. Your body is immediately trying on all of its detox protocols because you've been overloaded. Like if I were to chug gasoline, you'll have an acute response. That's toxic overload response. Now, again, yes, we accumulate toxins, and can it affect our constitution, our energy levels? 100%. But often The lymph nodes and your detox pathways that are not working properly are because you're in some form of self-devaluation, which governs those areas. So you go, is it the toxins or is it your ability to detox that is the actual issue? Because what about all the people that have been exposed to the same toxins, but they detox just fine? Well, their pathways are open. Well, what governs the pathways? The brain. Well, what governs the brain? The psyche. So we still go back to, if we're really looking at root cause, at least for my investigations, I can't land on something physical for 99% of cases.
And I find that absolutely fascinating. And I consider myself pretty, tuned in to a lot of what you're talking about here. But I think something I'm getting from this podcast is just how important this living a biological life is.
Yeah.
And when I think about those indigenous tribes, and I was reading a report recently how I think they discovered one tribe in the Amazon uncontacted, and there was just no cancer, no heart disease, no anything. And these people were living until their 80s and they just couldn't find chronic disease. And
Yeah.
I immediately went to, well, they're eating, this fresh living water and it's purely organic diet. But of course, those are going to play a role. But I had thought immediately about just how important it is that these people feel valued.
Yeah.
They're safe in their territory. And the other factors that you've described, and
Yep.
perhaps that was what was decisive, not the fact they weren't smoking cigarettes and eating McDonald's.
Right.
Yeah, it's so important. So we talked about these laws, and you've described the conflict active phase and then the healing phase. I wonder if it's worth just touching on a couple of the other laws in a bit more detail.
Yeah. So we have I'm using my words here because in the trainings that I've done, I've helped to become a little more layman. So I call this one the law of causation, which is essentially the chain of causation. We go psyche, brain, organ. So this just says before any symptom, you have an event in the psyche, which is that DHS, those three criteria: caught off guard, overwhelmed, shocked, and isolated. That then affects the brain, that then affects the organ. So it's understanding law of causation. There's microbe synergy, which is microbes and now they didn't do a lot of studies specifically on parasites, but what they found, and it was a lot of parasites, when they looked at what's inside of these parasites, you'll find they're filled with, a lot of them are filled with heavy metals. So you have parasites in your system and they're eating heavy metals, and I go, that kind of sounds like a synergistic relationship. So there's a lot of parasites, obviously, that we need. All of us have parasites. And I'm under the inclination that all parasites fit under the same category of there's some synergistic co-evolutionary reason for them in your body that is actually benefiting the organism. So it says bacteria, fungi, mold, parasites. We've co-evolved with them for millions of years. There's actually a synergistic relationship there, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So not to fear them. There's another law called quintessence. Quintessence is kind of how Dr. Hammer summed up all of the laws. He said, everything in nature is happening for the benefit of the organism. There's not one thing, there's not a hidden virus out there that wants to kill you. There's not an aspect of nature that's attacking another aspect of nature out of jealousy or anger or competition. If there is something in the forest, for example, that looks like a type of attack, it's meaningful, it's specialized, and it's for the benefit of the whole. And so when you find that truth in biology, you also have to find that truth in the rest of life. And it's really a paradigm shift. It's really a radical different way of relating to life, as there is a self-organizing governing force. We could say synchronicity, the self-organizing principle, is an actual law of nature that's built into the very fabric of nature, and we are nature. And so that's kind of the closest you'll get. And this is why in my courses I go a lot deeper than german medicine, because there are very spiritual implications about what is the design of nature, and what does that mean for us and our relationship to it. And ultimately, for me, it releases fear, and it releases this sense of feeling separate from life.
Mm. And I have to be honest with you, Brent, I'm immediately somewhat confronted by that, because when I think of like a friend of mine who I worked with some time ago who had this sort of flesh-eating bug and it ate half his arm away and he's got these horrific scars. I'm like, oh, I'm not sure I'm quite ready to accept that as like beneficial. I mean, is that a common reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't present in my courses, I don't present that principle until our very last week. So we're going through a lot of examples of, some devastating disease or some devastating experience. But there's multiple levels. Our German New Medicine will show us how healing phases can be really extreme, because when we're so far removed from living biologically, we have conflicts that aren't normally found in nature. It's not natural to be isolated and live in a box and
Right.
sit down. If I sit here long enough staring at the screen, I might get a little DHS. And my brain might go, wait, you're trapped? You're stuck? This isn't natural. And I might start getting restless leg syndrome, which is an epicrisis, saying, no, you need to move. You're stuck. And if you're ever stuck in nature, tiger is going to kill you. So we live so unbiologically that we can have conflicts over years. They're meant to happen for a day to help you get out of a situation, adapt, and then you return to biological living and you go into resolution, and you might have a little runny nose in your healing phase. And that's it. But we're so far removed that we have these really intense healing phases that you don't see in a lot of these tribes and whatnot. So we go, okay, how is that happening for the whole? Well, it's showing us on one level how disconnected from living biologically we are. Because to have that intense of a healing phase means this conflict load was incredibly intense. And we want to figure out what that is and then teach and live the resolution in the world. And that's how we could live in accordance with the law, is how we understand, perceive, and respond to situations like that. Because we still have to choose it. See, we can override these laws in our psyche, but it doesn't mean they're not working. It just means we're going to perceive them as working against us instead of for us. But that's ultimately, in my view, how they're working. They're working to show us what's not biological and what doesn't work, which leads to an acute amount of unnecessary suffering that we're seeing all over the world.
Right. Right. And I can understand now the link to the spiritual perspective, because at a certain level, all of this is in the realm of biology, psyche. I mean, it's a different take on our material nature, but it's still oriented in the material.
Right.
And I get that at a certain level, if you want to take a higher perspective, you need to start exploring the spiritual dimension.
Yeah. And there's one word that German medicine brought me to, which is not new to me, but it really made sense when you understand the 5 laws, is that there's an incentive to learn in this human experience. There's an incentive to learn. Our body typically necessitates the need to learn and transform at a fundamental level, because we'll have a symptom that's so loud and we may try all the things, the physical things. And for those of you listening and that hasn't worked, you'll be, in a sense, forced to a non-physical solution, which, if you actually get to root cause, it requires you to transform some shocking event in your past that fundamentally changed your personality. And typically what happens is there's a loss of authenticity. And that's kind of the trade we make. I'm going to trade my authenticity for safety. So there is this natural rediscovery of authenticity. I call it our design. And there is a biological design in general for males and females in German medicine. But it's a recovery of this design that we suppressed because of shocking experiences, and go, okay, I'm not going to be that expressive anymore. I'm not going to let myself be vulnerable and tender anymore. I'm not going to explore my excitement and joy anymore, because last time it happened, I had this shocking event, and now my personality changed, let's say, to be a little OCD and controlling, and I think that's just who I am. Well, eventually that's going to create a chronic condition. It usually leads to some chronic condition. But I have to see that the chronic condition is preceded by a chronic way of being that's rooted in an identity that is an adaptation to a shock that caused me to lose authenticity for pseudo safety. And when I can see what that assignment is for me, then I see that the root cause is really a recovery of an authentic aspect of myself, that as I do the emotional work, as I do the inquiry work, I can return to something that just feels so me and feels so natural. And most of the things that I think I'm looking for out there, I start to realize I don't need to look for them anymore. And in the absence of looking, there's a having, or there's a being of, there's a being. And I go, oh, maybe, again, from a higher level, my symptoms, since I wasn't going to do that voluntarily, my symptoms forced me to do it out of necessity. And if that whole arc of learning is the point, not just resolving a symptom, that whole arc of learning, which leads to more joy, more fulfillment, more health, all of it, if that's the point, now I'm focusing on the game of life that really matters, where the game presented to me was go to school, get good grades, get a job, and then eventually you retire. And if you're good enough, you go to heaven. It's like, there's the game. But the game of the game is that very specific curriculum that your body will outline for you very well, that if you take it on, you will go through that death and rebirth process.
Right. The spiritual game.
Yeah.
The evolution game.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's profound. You touched briefly on the inquiry level, and I realize we've pretty much devoted this entire podcast to German New Medicine. Of course, you're also a founder of Integrated Somatic Inquiry. Sounds like we've touched on some aspects of it, but is it worth you elaborating on what that is for us?
Yeah, I'll give a high-level outline. So first of all, somatic inquiry, I don't consider it a modality in the sense that here's a technique and a tool. You can relate to it as a tool. But to me, it's an understanding of the psyche, the unconscious, subconscious, and conscious dynamics, and why we hold on to and reinforce certain beliefs and ways of being, and how you could say to let them go. So I'm actually going to have to plug this in and use the other mic. My battery's dying on this, so let me just... There we go. Might not sound as good, but I'll just finish this way. So
the message is still great.
Okay, good. Yeah, as long as they can understand. So it's an understanding of how our core identity, which typically sounds like a I am blank or an I am not blank. Most of us have maybe 3 or 4 core identity statements that we've reinforced over time. Now, that core identity is different from a belief or just a perception. The core identity shapes what I believe and how I perceive, which then from there, I experience certain emotions. And those emotions, again, are windows into beliefs and perception, which are windows into identity. So I have identity, and then I have beliefs and perception, emotion, thoughts, my dominant conscious thought process. And then ultimately, I have the choices, the actions I take. And then my body is an aggregate of everything preceding it. And its symptoms, this is where I always say the grossest level contains, you could say like the most non-etheric, non-physical, divine, but it's like those symptoms are actually going to point me all the way back to that core identity. And so the somatic inquiry process is using the soma, right, the body and mind, but we're going through the body to speak and to have a window into identity. And we use the process of certain questions and certain ways of following the sensation in the body to highlight, to put words. It's really, if you think of cymatics, it's like every word has a certain energy to it. So we're really getting to this like energetic blueprint that words, we just put words to, but we suss out the core identity statements that create an entire chain of living unbiologically, of living in suffering, of not living your design, or you can call it authenticity. And we trace it back to those original, you could say kind of blueprints or original identity statements. And so the first step is just bringing awareness. Then we'll question if it's true. We'll use, in a sense, the mind to undo the mind, which is when we really are able to see something we couldn't previously see. One of the Achilles heels to a negative, I'll call it a negative belief. And what I mean by negative belief is a negation of self. So if I believe this, I'm negating an aspect of my authentic self. That's what makes it negative, and that is suffering. So if I'm looking at a negative belief, it can't sustain a logical conclusion of its validity if I look at it clearly. And it has to, by definition, use some form of illusion. And we see this on the subatomic level. You see electrons, protons, and neutrons. The electron, the negative charge, is always in a cloud of illusion. You can't really, the proton is big, positive. It's right there. You can see it. Same thing with beliefs. It has to hide, and we know from the survival mechanism, it tries to hide from you because it just wants you to survive. Because don't go investigate all that painful stuff. Forget that, compartmentalize that, and adapt. So we're digging that up, and we're looking at some of these core blueprints that we're using language to state, and we're able to look at it and go, okay, is this a fact? Is this truth? Or is this just a belief? We're looking at the evidence. We're also looking at its utility. There's an entire book written about this called Existential Kink, and it basically says you love your patterns. You're not going to let them go if you need them or if you want them, because you get to feel special. You get to not take ownership over your life. You get to avoid failure. So we look at things like utility. Wait a second. Do I want this?
Yeah, definitely relate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we're just going through this really precise, there's actually 10 steps, but it's dynamic. Investigation of some of these core identities, not to learn how to let them go, but to learn that we don't need them and there's no utility in them and that they're not true about who we are. And by having your clear gestalt moment of going, wait, that's not who I am and I don't need that, that identity will leave you. Well, it will let go of you. You don't do the letting go. You figure out why you're holding on. And in the absence of needing to hold on to it, there's healing. There's a release of contraction, a state of contraction. And what's in its absence is a question I ask a lot. What's in its absence? I'm not good enough. I'm bad. I'm disgusting. Who would you be in its absence? And what would you do differently in your life, in your business, in your relationship? And that ends up being your assignment that points you to what the opposite of your conflict activity looks like. It points you to resolution. It points you to a version of you you're yet to be familiar with, which again, in the beginning, there could be some flip-flopping between who I have been and what's familiar and what's new. And so we hold them through that process so they can go, okay, who would I be in the absence of this now? And they get very specific with, oh, in the absence of this in my work, I wouldn't work here anymore.
Okay.
And maybe that's what they needed to do to resolve their territory conflict. But they couldn't have forced it before because they didn't have the identity change. It would have been too scary.
Okay.
Would I be in the absence of this?
Yeah. It's like a bridge. It sounds like you're creating bridges for people to move out of their conflict and their hanging conflicts, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. I just.
No, you're great. I'll just give the example of like, if it's, I am not loved. If that's a core context, I call these contexts. That's a core context for someone. They might, in their relationship, instead of seeking love, they might just give love. So a whole way of, and you got to get radically honest. How do I seek love? What does it look like? How I look, how I talk, all these strategies that I employ, how would be there in the absence? First of all, more energy, more authenticity, more creativity, and probably more compassion and empathy for you towards them. Probably more listening. because your nervous system's relaxed. And so we start to actually show what, and that's another way of saying living biologically. These will always point to that, but it's very specific for each person. And so often they can't even conceive of what it looks like to be that until they've seen the opposite, which is what they've been living so clearly. Now then they can start to conceive of what resolution would look like for them.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Brandon, I know that you had a hard stop, doesn't it? So it feels like we've just started part 2, which is like the whole somatic inquiry. It feels like we do another hour on that. But I know you're short on time. I also need to get back to my kids at some point. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. You've really enriched my understanding of what it means to live biologically, of German new medicine. You've brought it to life so vividly, and then you've added in what I perceive as this bridge, out of your conflicts, you don't always hear elaborated in the context of German new medicine, which makes total sense to me. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been my pleasure. This is really fun. It felt like 2-minute conversation. It just went by.
Yeah. And we didn't get to the swords, man. I wanted
Man.
to get to the swords, but there we are. Kind of everything. Maybe there'll be a part 2 at some point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks once again. So for people to find you, it's Brandon Bozarth, brandonbozarth.com.
That's right.
BrandonBozz, if you're American, ARTH.com. You're also on Instagram, Brandon.Bozarth, where there's some very funny videos made by your fiance, which I highly recommend. Anywhere else you'd send them?
That's it for now. I have a lot of free content in the link in my bio on my Instagram and on YouTube. So just look for the links there.
Awesome. Thanks once again. It's been awesome.
Yep. Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
I'll put those links in the show description. Fantastic. Thank you.